The night frequency. The shift began at 2200 UTC. Kari arrived at the radio room at 5 minutes before the hour, which was the custom. She had come from the kitchen, where she had filled the thermos and taken a slice of the bread that had been left out. The walk from the kitchen to the radio room was brief, 10 meters down the main corridor, but it was the transition from the inhabited parts of the station to the working space, and she made it at the same pace every night, not hurrying, not lingering, the thermos under her arm and the bread in her hand. She had developed this pace in the first weeks and had not changed it. The radio room door was closed, as it was between shifts, to keep the equipment at working temperature without the heating load from the rest of the station competing with the equipment's own heat. She opened the door and stepped in. The room had the particular quality of a space that had been closed and warm and occupied for many hours, not stuffy. The ventilation kept the air fresh, but dense with the warmth of the electronics and with the specific smell of a working radio room. Warm electronics, the oil of the equipment, the slight metallic quality of the electronics racks. She set the thermos on the shelf and ate the last of the bread standing, looking at the room and the equipment. The previous operator, her colleague Tor, who worked the 1400 to 2200 watch, had left the room as he always left it. The logbook was open at the current page, the last entry in his compact handwriting, noting the 2150 contact with the supply ship in the Weddell Sea. Signal report, 5 and 8. Frequency 4636 kilohertz. Duration 4 minutes. The ship was making good progress and expected to reach Sunai in 3 days. She read through the log from the beginning of his shift, noting the quality of contacts across the hours. The 1400 sked with Tromsø had been good. Tor had given them a 5 and 9, full signal both ways. By 1800, the aurora had begun and the higher frequencies had become difficult. He had moved the interstation contacts to the lower bands, and the quality had held through the evening. She noted the frequency choices he had made during the aurora period, the shift to lower bands, the specific frequencies he had selected for each contact. He had chosen well. The frequencies were consistent with what she would have chosen in the same conditions, and the signal reports he had obtained confirmed that the choices had been appropriate. The 6 MHz band had held up well for the intra-Antarctic contacts, even with the aurora active, which was consistent with her own experience of the 6 MHz band in similar conditions. She also noted the ship contact, the last entry on Tor's page. A 5 and 8 signal on a 4 MHz frequency, the ship in good position. No concerns. She would be working with the same ship on the schedule over the next several days as it made its way to its destination. The operator she had recognized in the contact was likely to be on the same watch tomorrow night. She set the log down and checked the ionosonde printout, clipped to the board above the frequency table. The ionosonde was an instrument that sent signals up into the atmosphere at various frequencies and recorded the reflection back from the ionosphere, building a picture of the ionosphere's layers above the station. The printout showed the FOF2, the critical frequency of the F2 layer, which governed the maximum usable frequency for long-distance contacts, as a line of dots plotted through the hours of the previous day. In summer, this line would be higher, the F2 layer charged by solar ultraviolet and reflecting higher frequencies. In the polar night, the line was lower and more variable. The dots for the afternoon hours showed the disturbance from the aurora. The line wavered, dipped twice below 5 MHz, then recovered. By early evening, the FOF2 had stabilized at around 7 MHz. She wrote the figure in the frequency column for the 2200 hour, 7.2 MHz predicted. She understood the ionosphere well enough to work with it intuitively, but she had made a point of learning the underlying physics formally when she first went to the Arctic, reading through the relevant chapters of a radio propagation handbook during the long early career watches when the skeds were few and the monitoring intervals were long. The ionosphere was a set of charged layers at altitude, the charges sustained by solar radiation. The different layers, D, E, and F, had different heights and different properties, and they interacted with radio waves in different ways depending on the frequency. The D layer, lowest of the three, was the main absorber of lower frequency HF signals. It formed during the day when solar UV ionized the lower atmosphere, and it collapsed at night when the ionization source was removed. At night, with the D layer gone, the lower HF frequencies were absorbed less and could travel farther before being lost. This was why certain frequencies worked better at night than during the day. The F layer, highest of the three, was the main reflector for long-distance HF communication. During the day it split into two sublayers with different properties. At night these merged back into a single layer. The merged F layer at night was often more stable and reflective than the daytime layers, which made night conditions good for long-distance contacts on the right frequencies. In polar regions, this basic pattern was altered by the absence of solar radiation. The F layer held its nighttime characteristics through the entire polar night, which created both advantages and complications. The aurora was the principal complication. The aurora was caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with the Earth's magnetic field and cascading into the ionosphere, depositing energy that disrupted the ionospheric layers over the polar caps. Where the aurora was active, the ionosphere above it was disturbed, signals scattered, frequencies that should have been clear became noisy, paths that should have been reliable failed. Learning which frequencies were most affected by which type of aurora, and which paths were most sensitive to disturbances at which part of the route, was a significant part of operating a polar radio station competently. She had been learning this for 11 months. The radio room was at the center of the station building, insulated from the exterior walls by the kitchen and the equipment corridor that formed a buffer zone between the electronics and the cold. Even so, she could read the outside temperature by the sound the building made, the slight creak of the steel frame as the temperature outside changed, and by the frost on the lower edge of the equipment corridor door. Tonight, the frost was about 3 centimeters up. Outside it would be around -28. The forecast had said -30 overnight, with light southerly wind. She turned on the number 2 transceiver. The startup procedure for the number 2 was brief but deliberate. She powered the set and waited for the self-test to complete. The set ran a check of its internal circuits on startup and displayed a status indicator on the panel. Green. She adjusted the volume and the squelch to her preferred settings, which were slightly different from the settings Tor used. She kept the volume slightly lower than he did, and her squelch level was set a fraction above his. These were small differences, and she had never asked him to set the controls to her levels before leaving his shift. She reset them herself at the beginning of each shift as part of the startup routine. The transceiver she preferred for the night skeds was the number 2 set, a Kodan NGT SRX, the more recent of the station's 2 main HF units. It had a quieter receiver than the older number 1, which had a slight audio hum in its output that she found distracting on the long overnight shifts when signals were faint and she was listening at the edge of readability. The number 2 was cleaner. The receiver's noise figure, the measure of how much noise the receiver itself added to the incoming signal, was noticeably lower than the number 1's. On a contact where the received signal was weak and the external noise floor was low, this difference in noise figure was the difference between a marginally readable signal and a clearly readable one. She had noted in the log once that she preferred the number 2 for night work, and since then Tor had been leaving it on standby when he moved contacts to the lower bands in the evenings. She checked the antenna switch panel. The station had 6 antennas of various types deployed in the snowfield behind and to the sides of the building. She could not see them from inside. The polar night was complete outside the windows, but she knew each one by its position on the switch panel. The A1 was a long-wired dipole oriented east-west, primarily for contacts in the southern African and South American sectors. The A2 was a rhombic, a large directional antenna pointed north toward Europe and the equatorial stations. A 3 and a 4 were shorter dipoles for the lower frequency bands and the local net. A 5 was the VHF aerial on the building's roof, used for aircraft communications and for the field camps when they were occupied. A 6 was the omnidirectional whip used for broadcast monitoring and general survey. She connected the number 2 set to the A2 rhombic for the first sked and checked the antenna tuning unit. The automatic tuner cycled through its range and settled on the matching network for 4635 kilohertz. The SWR reading came up on the panel, 1.2 to 1. Good. She had seen this antenna run as high as 2.8 to 1 in heavy rime ice conditions, when ice loading on the wire changed the antenna's resonant properties and the tuner could not fully compensate. The crew had been out 3 times in the previous winter to knock ice off the rhombic feed line with a long pole. Tonight, the reading was clean. The rhombic was her preferred antenna for the main skeds. It was the most directive of the station's antennas. A rhombic was designed to focus most of its transmitted and received energy in one direction, in this case, toward the north and northwest, where the primary contact targets were. This directivity gave it an advantage over the simpler dipoles and the omnidirectional whip. It concentrated the energy onto the useful path, rather than radiating equally in all directions, which meant stronger received signals and less noise from directions other than the target. The rhombic's geometry was visible in her mind in the way that familiar equipment was. 4 wire elements, each about 40 meters long, arranged in a diamond shape in the horizontal plane, supported at the 4 corners by wooden poles set in the snow. The feed point was at the south end of the diamond, the end facing the building, and the terminating resistor was at the north end. The terminating resistor absorbed any energy that reached the far end of the antenna, rather than allowing it to reflect back, which gave the antenna its directional properties. A rhombic without a terminating resistor would be bidirectional. With the resistor, it was unidirectional, pointing north. The feed line ran from the south corner of the rhombic to the building, a balanced transmission line that she always checked for ice before the main contacts. The line's exterior was a plastic jacket over the twin conductors, and in cold conditions ice could form on the jacket and add capacitance to the line, which shifted the antenna's resonant frequency and showed up as a changed SWR reading. The 1.2 to 1 reading tonight meant the line was clean. She connected the number 2 set to the rhombic and confirmed the antenna tuner position. She keyed the microphone and transmitted a short carrier to check the output. The power meter swung to 100 watts and held steady. She released the key. The room's background sound settled back to what it always was during the night shift: the soft hiss of the receiver's squelch, the low steady thrum of the station's generator 2 rooms over, the faint creak of the building's frame. The first scheduled contact was at 22:30. She was working the interstation net, the scheduled contact program between Norwegian Polar Institute facilities and the ships and stations they coordinated with. This night the schedule showed a contact with the ship at 22:30, a contact with the Neumayer 3 German station at 23:30, and a contact with the Institute's operations center in Tromsø at 00:30. Between these and through the long early morning hours were the standard monitoring duties, a listening watch on the international distress and calling frequency, recording any traffic on the general Antarctic net, and hourly noise level measurements on the band. She wrote the schedule in the top margin of the new log page and drew light pencil lines at each contact time, so she could see at a glance how much of the interval had passed. The ship contact at 22:30 was brief. She had been working the Antarctic frequency schedule for 11 months at this posting, and the ship contacts had a particular familiarity: the same few operators rotating through the same watches on the same vessels, the same formulaic exchange of signal reports and position and weather and status. Tonight's operator on the vessel was a man she had spoken to perhaps a dozen times over the months, enough to recognize his voice and his operating rhythm before he had finished transmitting his call sign. The signal was moderate on 4635. He gave her a 5 and 7, readable, good signal strength. She gave him a 5 and 6, slightly noisier on her end, the aurora contributing a faint warbling to the background that raised the noise floor without obscuring the signal. They exchanged the ship's position, 8 degrees south of the Antarctic Circle, making good speed in light pack ice. Weather at the vessel: overcast, -12, southeast wind at 15 knots. No problems to report. She read back the position and conditions, and he confirmed them. She gave him the station's latest weather observation: -28, light wind, overcast, no precipitation. He copied and thanked her. The contact closed at 22:36. 6 minutes. She wrote the entry in the log. She wrote the frequency, the signal reports, the ship's position and weather, the station weather, the duration, and her initials. The entry took about 2 minutes to complete properly in the logbook's pre-ruled columns. The log was a cloth-bound book with heavy paper stock, the paper chosen to resist the moisture that occasionally got into the radio room when equipment doors were left open during cold conditions. She had been through 2 complete logbooks in 11 months, and was part-way through a third. The completed books sat on the shelf above the equipment rack, labeled with start and end dates in her handwriting. She had read through some of the older station logs in her first weeks, before she had fully learned the routine and still had long quiet periods to fill. The older logs were interesting in the way that operational records were always interesting, not for drama, but for the small variations in how different operators had approached the same problems. The frequency choices in the earlier years reflected a different understanding of the ionospheric propagation at this latitude. Some of the older operators had used a more detailed signal reporting convention that recorded the noise level separately from the signal strength. Some had included personal observations about the aurora or the weather that went slightly beyond the standard format. One log from a winter many years earlier had a section at the end of each shift's record where the operator had written a brief paragraph, not in the standard column format but in ordinary prose, describing the character of the shift. Not the contact records or the measurements, but the quality of the night, whether the band had been active or dead, what the aurora had looked like, whether any unusual traffic had come through, what the station had sounded like in the early morning hours. These entries were not required and had not been required of any operator since. But they made the log of that winter distinct. Reading it was like reading the record of a specific night, rather than an anonymized sequence of data points. She had adopted a version of this in her own log. Not at the end of the shift, where she was too tired to write clearly, but in the monitoring notes during the shift, brief descriptive lines about the band's character, the aurora, the specific quality of a particular contact. These were her addition to the standard format, and she had kept them consistently since her second month. She found these additions useful. The operational record was most valuable when it preserved specific observations that could not be recovered from the standard data. At 22:40, she set the receiver to monitor the international distress frequency and settled into the chair. The distress frequency, 4125 kilohertz, was maintained under a continuous listening watch whenever the primary transceivers were not in active use. This was absolute requirement, not optional practice. There had been no distress traffic in her 11 months at the station. The Antarctic was not a busy maritime region in the way of the North Atlantic or the Pacific shipping lanes, and the vessels operating in these waters were well equipped and carefully managed. But the requirement to maintain a watch was absolute, and she did so without impatience. She had heard distress traffic twice in a previous posting at a coastal radio station in northern Norway. Both times the careful monitoring had been the condition that made the rapid response possible. The distress calling frequency was one of the few international radio regulations that had remained essentially unchanged for decades. While other frequency allocations had shifted as the radio spectrum became more crowded and the uses of HF changed, the maritime distress frequencies had been preserved because the consequence of losing them was too serious to contemplate. A vessel in difficulty in the Southern Ocean, below the satellite coverage that had made so many other communication systems routine, could still reach a coast radio station or a rescue coordination center on 4125. This was not a theoretical possibility but a regular occurrence in the waters around Antarctica, where the weather was severe and the distances were large and the vessels sometimes small and old. She had read the accident reports in the station documentation, a file of incident summaries going back some years, compiled as part of the safety briefing material. The incidents in these waters were various: fishing vessels in deteriorating conditions, yacht voyages that had underestimated the Southern Ocean, research ships with equipment failures. A consistent theme in the reports was that communication, the ability to reach a coordination center or another vessel, had been the critical factor in the successful responses. This was what the distress watch was for. She listened to the quiet on 4125 and hoped it would remain quiet. The interval between 22:30 and 23:30 gave her an hour. She used the first few minutes of this interval to update her frequency prediction chart. The frequency prediction chart was a document she maintained herself, separate from the official ionosonde printout. Where the ionosonde gave the actual measured FOF2 at hourly intervals, her chart was a working document, a table of frequencies arranged by time and by contact direction, with notes on what had worked and what had not over the previous weeks. She updated it after each significant contact, adding a tick if the frequency had performed within the predicted range and a note if it had deviated. The chart had become detailed over 11 months. Looking at it from the beginning, the early weeks showed few marks. The chart had been sparse because she had not yet learned what to watch for. By the third month it was denser, the notes in the margins more specific. By midwinter the chart was a reference document she used before every contact to choose a frequency, checking the predicted FOF2 from the ionosonde against her accumulated notes on what frequencies had worked on each path at each time of year. The path to the ship tonight had behaved slightly better than the chart predicted. She had expected a 5 and 5 and received a 5 and 7. She added a note, 4,635 kilohertz, tonight plus 2 S units relative to prediction, aurora moderate, possible FOF2 higher than measured. She would need a few more data points to confirm whether the prediction was consistently low for this path at this time of year, but the pattern had appeared twice in the previous week. She used part of the remaining interval to check the antenna maintenance records. Each antenna had a maintenance log, a simple sheet clipped inside the antenna cabinet recording any work done to the antenna, any anomalies in performance, and the SWR readings from the weekly checks. She pulled the sheets for the A2 rhombic and the A1 dipole and read through the most recent entries. The rhombic had been performing consistently through the winter. The most recent entry from 10 days ago showed an SWR of 1.3 to 1 at the primary operating frequency, close to tonight's reading. The wire elements were holding their geometry, and the feed line was dry. In her first Antarctic posting she had worked with a rhombic that had been damaged by a storm and had run intermittent faults for months before the wire was finally replaced in the brief summer maintenance window. A well-performing rhombic had a clean quality to its received signals that was distinct from the omnidirectional antennas, a directional focus that improved signal-to-noise on the paths it was aimed at. The dipole record had an anomaly from November, a reading of 2.1 to 1 at the low end of the frequency range, which had resolved after a warming spell softened the ice that had been loading the wire. She had included this in her monthly report to Tromsø. The reading had been normal since December. She added a note in tonight's date column, reading at 2200 1.2 to 1, consistent with recent checks. She put the sheets back in their cabinet and checked the clock. 23:02. She made the hourly noise measurement. The procedure was standard: tune the receiver to a quiet portion of the band with no known active stations and record the background noise level on the meter for a 30-second average. The result was written in the noise column of the log, a number in decibels above the thermal noise floor of the receiver. Tonight's reading was 12. Moderate. The aurora was contributing a broad diffuse hiss at the low end of the HF band that raised the noise floor without completely obscuring a good signal. She had learned to read the noise level as a general guide to ionospheric conditions. A reading below 8 meant the path was probably clear and signals would come through cleanly. Between 8 and 15 meant some aurora activity, manageable with care. Above 15, the noise became significant and she adjusted her frequency choices accordingly. Above 20, the band was difficult and she would note it prominently in the log. Tonight's 12 was workable. She expected the Neumayer contact at 23:30 to be good. She looked out the porthole at the end of the radio room. The porthole was a small double-pane window set at shoulder height in the outer wall, looking across the snowfield toward the south. The glass was clear tonight, the outside temperature cold enough to prevent the ice fog that sometimes formed against the outer pane in transitional temperatures. The sky outside was clear and very dark. The aurora australis was visible low on the southern horizon, a pale curtain of greenish-white light, its base at about 50 degrees elevation, not reaching overhead, moving slowly. The curtain shifted at its upper edge in the way that quiet auroras moved, a slow drift that was different from the fast-moving rays and structures of an active display. She had been watching the aurora through this porthole since the beginning of the polar night, which at this latitude had begun in mid-May. In the first weeks she had been watching closely, learning the range of what the aurora did in this part of Antarctica. By the middle of winter, she watched it as she watched the noise meter or the SWR panel, with attention but without urgency, reading its quality as information about the ionospheric conditions above the station. A quiet aurora like tonight's, a low pale curtain, slow-moving, not reaching overhead, corresponded to a moderate K-index and moderate noise levels on the band. A moderately active display, brighter curtains reaching higher in the sky, faster movement, occasional rays corresponded to a K-index of 4 or 5 and conditions on the band that required careful frequency management. An active aurora, the kind she had seen only a handful of times over the winter, curtains filling the entire sky from horizon to horizon, rays converging overhead in a corona, the whole structure moving with visible speed, corresponded to a K-index of 7 or 8 and conditions where the higher frequencies were essentially unusable and even the lower bands were noisy. The most active display she had seen was in late June, a night when the K-index had reached 8 and stayed there for 4 hours. She had stepped outside during that period, something she rarely did in the middle of a shift, because the light through the porthole had been so unusual that she wanted to see it without the intervening glass. Outside, with her headlamp off and her eyes adjusted, the aurora had filled everything, a structure that occupied the entire sky at once, moving with a complexity that made it difficult to fix on any part. She had stood outside for perhaps 5 minutes and then gone back to the radio room, because the band during this period was producing noise readings of 22 decibels and she needed to document the conditions carefully and decide which contacts to defer. She had documented this correlation carefully in the log over the winter months and had sent a summary of the observations to a colleague at the institute in Tromsø who worked on ionospheric research. The Neumayer contact at 23:30 was good. She had worked Neumayer, the German Alfred Wegener Institute station, also in Queen Maud Land, but roughly 800 kilometers to the east, many times over the winter. The operator tonight was a woman she had spoken with often enough to know well in the specific way of radio colleagues, closely in terms of technical communication, barely at all in terms of anything outside the operating procedure. This was the ordinary texture of radio contact. The voice was familiar without anything else being familiar. The voice on the Neumayer frequency was one she would have recognized among many. Each radio operator had a characteristic pattern of speech on the air: speed, rhythm, emphasis, the specific quality of their enunciation of the standard phrases. These patterns were not deliberate, but they were consistent, and after many contacts with the same operator she knew them the way she knew a musical phrase heard many times. The Neumayer operator spoke at a measured pace, slightly slower than average, which produced clear copy even in marginal conditions. She had noticed this and had noted in her personal notebook early in the winter that the operators who spoke slowly produced fewer miscopied signal reports than the operators who spoke at normal conversational pace. Tonight Neumayer came up cleanly on the frequency she had selected, 6810 kHz. The path between the stations at this range, with a good F2 layer, was a single bounce. The signal went up at an angle, reflected from the ionospheric layer, and came down again 800 kilometers away. The transit time was a fraction of a second, imperceptible in the exchange of voice communication. The signal quality on a single bounce path, when conditions were good, was typically the cleanest she worked with. The signal arrived without the slight echo that multi-hop paths sometimes produced and without the Doppler shift that a rapidly changing ionosphere could impose on a longer path. She gave Neumayer a 5 and 9, perfectly readable, full signal, and received the same back. The exchange covered signal reports, station weather, and operational notes. Neumayer reported that the aurora the previous night had been significantly more active than tonight's display. Their frequency work had been difficult through the middle hours, the noise floor elevated and several contacts degraded. She noted this in the log: aurora highly active at Noumea previous night, operations affected, now settled. The contact closed at 23:42. She refilled her coffee cup from the thermos she kept on the shelf beside the rack. The thermos was one of the small domestic objects that made the 12-hour shift manageable. She filled it at the beginning of each shift from the kitchen, carrying it the 10 meters down the corridor to the radio room, and rationed it through the night in cups spaced roughly 2 hours apart. The coffee was unremarkable, the station's standard ground coffee from a supply replenished every 3 months by the logistics flights. She had been drinking it for 11 months and no longer tasted it in any particular way. It was warm, and she drank it at the correct intervals. She had once worked a night shift at a station that had a coffee machine in the control room, a small automated unit that produced cup after cup without requiring any thought. She had found this a disadvantage. The effort of managing the thermos, of knowing how much was left and rationing accordingly, was a small act of self-management that made the shift feel more orderly. The moments of refilling the cup were markers in the long overnight interval, indicators of how much time had passed and how much remained. She sat with the cup and listened to the band. The HF band in the polar night had a quality that she had come to think of as its specific voice. Every radio environment had its characteristic sound, the specific mixture of noise types and signal types that came from the geography, the propagation conditions, the time of day, the season. A maritime coastal station heard a different band from an inland station. An equatorial station heard a different band from a polar station. The Antarctic band was the most distinctive she had worked with. The aurora noise had a character that was not present at lower latitudes. The propagation paths were limited in ways that gave the band fewer signals and more silence than the bands she had known elsewhere. What arrived on the antenna was selected by the ionosphere in a different way from the selection that mid-latitude stations experienced. She had tried to describe this in a letter to a colleague who worked at a station in coastal Norway. She had written that the Antarctic band sounded more deliberate, fewer signals, each one more audible in the spaces between the noise. Her colleague had replied that this sounded like a quality she was projecting onto the band rather than a property of the band itself. She had thought about this and decided that the distinction was not entirely clear. The band had properties. She had attention. The two produced what she heard. Whether that was the band's quality or her own was not a question she needed to resolve. The HF band in the early hours of the polar night had its own particular quality. She had worked in radio rooms at Arctic latitudes too, 2 winters in northern Norway and a season at the Svalbard stations, and the polar bands were different from the mid-latitude bands she had heard elsewhere. At mid-latitudes, the HF band in the quiet hours was relatively clean, the noise floor low and predictable. In the polar region, the aurora added a diffuse noise that was never quite absent, even on the quietest nights, and the propagation paths bent and shifted with the ionospheric disturbances in ways that required constant monitoring. The sound of the band on a quiet polar night was a soft, layered hiss. The lower component came from the receiver's own thermal noise, always present, independent of outside conditions. Above this, a higher, more variable sound came from the aurora's ionospheric effect and from the atmospheric radio noise generated by distant thunderstorms in the tropics, which propagated to these latitudes via the ionosphere. On some nights, scanning carefully through the band, she could hear the faint remnant of distant transmissions, a carrier wave from South America, the partial edge of a voice in a language she could not identify. She did not try to identify these sounds. She monitored them as background to the primary listening task. The 0030 contact with Tromsø was the most important of the shift. The Norwegian Polar Institute's operations center in Tromsø maintained a coordinated watch during Antarctic operation hours. The contact was two-way. She reported station status, weather, equipment condition, and any operational matters that had arisen during the shift. Tromsø reported back on logistics, any concerns from the Institute, and anything the wintering team should be informed of. Tonight's contact came up cleanly on 8955 kilohertz. The path between Troll Station and Tromsø was long, roughly 8,000 kilometers, the signal going up to the F2 layer and back down across the latitude, but the 8 MHz band was often good for this particular path in polar winter, when the absence of daytime solar UV allowed the F2 layer to hold its reflective properties through the long dark hours. What degraded the path was aurora over Scandinavia, which disturbed the ionosphere at the northern end of the contact and scattered the signal. Tonight there was no significant aurora over the north. The 8,000-kilometer path to Tromsø typically required 2 ionospheric hops. The signal went up at an angle from the transmitting antenna, was reflected by the F2 layer, came back down and struck the Earth's surface, reflected up again, was reflected by the F2 layer a second time, and came back down at Tromsø's antenna. Each hop introduced some loss, and some possibility of distortion. On good nights the double hop path produced a clean signal, no echo, no distortion. On difficult nights the signal on this path had a slight fluttery quality, the 2 hops arriving with slightly different delay, or slightly different phase, combining at the receiving antenna in a way that produced an audible effect. She had learned to recognize this flutter as the sound of a long path on a difficult night, and had noted it in the log with the signal report adjusted downward accordingly. Tonight there was no flutter. The signal arrived clean and steady. The Tromsø operator had a good signal, 5 and 8 on her readout, his assessment of her signal the same. The contact covered the standard items. Station status: all personnel well, equipment functioning normally, no medical or safety concerns. Weather: -28 at contact time, forecast -30 overnight, front developing to the west. Equipment: the A1 dipole ice loading anomaly from November, noted for the record, current performance normal. Logistics: an aircraft was planned for the following week, conditions permitting. She read these back, and the operator confirmed. He asked about the K-index forecast, and she told him what the space weather prediction showed for the next 48 hours. He acknowledged this, and said the operations center would be monitoring for any impact on the communication schedule. He told her there was mail on the planned flight. She wrote this in the log. The station had email and Iridium satellite telephone for personal communications, and mail therefore meant specifically physical mail, the deliberate kind, from people who had chosen to send something in a form that required planning and time. She had received a small package in the previous delivery, a box of dried fruit from her sister in Bergen, the contents well chosen and the packing careful enough to have survived the freight handling without damage. The contact with Tromsø closed at 0058. She wrote the log entry and then sat for a moment. The station was quiet around her. Not silent, the generator maintained its steady low thrum, the ventilation system pushed air through the building at its constant rate, and the radio equipment hummed its low continuous hum. But no voices, no footsteps, no movement she could detect from the rest of the station. The crew was in their rooms or asleep. The building was occupied but not present. This was the specific quality of the overnight shift. She had worked nights since her early career and had long since adjusted to the inverted schedule. Night work suited certain tasks, the pace was slower, the concentration could be sustained without distraction. The long intervals between the scheduled contacts gave time for the monitoring work to be thorough. Radio operating suited the night especially. The skeds came at their scheduled times, and between them the work was the listening, the recording, the careful attention to the band's behavior from one hour to the next. She had worked her first Antarctic winter at a larger station with 3 radio operators sharing the watches. The schedule there was busier, more contacts per shift, more vessels, a more complex coordination role through the summer months. She had found the busyness easier in some respects, contact to contact, each one a discrete task with a beginning and a completion. The intervals between contacts at a busy station were shorter and less clearly defined. She preferred the structure of the current posting, where the intervals were long enough to do the monitoring work thoroughly, and the contacts were few enough that each one received full attention. She had also found, at the larger station, that the team of 3 made certain things easier and certain things harder. The handover between 3 operators required more detailed notes than the handover between 2. The continuity of the monitoring observations was sometimes broken when a contact was split across 2 operators' shifts. And there was a social texture to the radio room at the larger station, the outgoing operator often still present when the incoming operator arrived. Brief conversation, a shared account of the shift before the actual handover, that was pleasant, but that sometimes blurred the transition in a way she found slightly unsatisfying. Tor's handovers and her own were clean. They had established the format in the first month, and maintained it consistently. The notes contained exactly what the next operator needed and nothing else. She made the 0-100 noise measurement. The reading had risen slightly, 14. She looked through the porthole. The aurora had brightened and moved higher in the sky. The pale curtain was now at about 60 degrees elevation and had taken on a more structured quality, the upper edge showing faint rays. She watched it for a moment, reading the display's quality the way she read the band, categorizing it, noting where it was in the range she had observed over the winter, comparing it to the forecast. The K-index of 3 that the Space Weather Prediction Center had given for tonight suggested this level of activity was within the expected range. A K-index of 4 or 5, forecast as possible for the following day, would bring more active displays and correspondingly worse conditions on the higher frequency bands. She pulled the forecast chart from the file and read through it again. The predicted increase was associated with a small coronal mass ejection from the Sun that had been reported 2 days ago, and was expected to reach the Earth's magnetosphere tomorrow. She noted this in the log. The Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, issued these forecasts on a daily cycle, the predictions based on satellite observations of the Sun and the solar wind. The Antarctic stations used them to plan frequency choices in advance, knowing that a K-index of 5 was coming tomorrow. She could plan to use lower frequency bands for all the morning skeds and to warn the Tromsø operator that the 8 MHz path might be difficult. She wrote these planning notes in the log's margin, where she kept her operational notes separate from the contact records. Between the Tromsø contact and the 0200 observation, she had 90 minutes. She spent part of this time reviewing the frequency schedule for the remainder of the night. The schedule showed 3 more contacts: the 0430 sked with Marambio, the 0715 sked with Sinai 5, and the possibility of a call from the Institute's second ship, a smaller research vessel working in the coastal waters that had not appeared in the schedule but that sometimes initiated contact when they had operational information to pass. She wrote these times in the margin of the log page and estimated the frequency she would use for each. For Marambio, she would try 6825, the same frequency she had used on the previous contact 2 weeks ago, which had produced a good signal. The path to Marambio crossed more of the Antarctic continent than the path to Noumea, which meant more exposure to the polar ionosphere and potentially more sensitivity to aurora disturbance. Tonight, with the aurora quiet, the path should be manageable. For Sinai, she would start on 4465, which had been the most reliable frequency for that path in the morning hours. The Sinai path ran northwest, partially over open ocean south of Africa, which gave it different ionospheric characteristics from the paths that ran across the interior of the continent. She wrote both frequencies in the schedule column of her working document. At 0200, she made the weather observation. The observation, called the METOBS in the standard abbreviation, was her responsibility on the night shift. She went to the weather instrument room, adjacent to the radio room, and read the sensors: outside temperature, wind speed and direction, atmospheric pressure and visibility. For the cloud cover observation, she went to the porthole at the end of the corridor, where the view overhead was better than through the radio room's small window. The sky was clear. She could see the full canopy of the southern sky, the Southern Cross very sharp and bright in its low position, the Magellanic Clouds visible as distinct diffuse patches above the horizon, the dense band of the Milky Way crossing from northeast to southwest. The Milky Way at this latitude and altitude, with no artificial light anywhere near the horizon in any direction, was brighter and more structured than she had seen it anywhere else in her life. She had grown up in Bergen, where the Milky Way was a theory rather than a visible feature of the sky. Here it was a dominant feature of every clear night, a broad river of light crossing the full width of the sky, its center toward the northeast, the densest part a band visibly textured with dark lanes of dust and bright concentrations of stars. She had learned the positions of the prominent stars and star clusters over the months in the way that she had learned the band, by repeated observation, noticing what appeared in sequence as the Earth's rotation moved the sky, noticing which objects were visible at which times of year. The winter had been long enough that she had moved through a substantial arc of the southern sky's annual cycle, watching stars that had been on the horizon in May climb toward the zenith by July. The aurora was still present, a pale structure at the southern edge of the sky, not bright enough to obscure the stars above it. She looked at the sky for a moment longer. The Southern Cross was very close to the horizon at its lowest point now. To the west, the Centaurus region was higher and more prominent. The two principal stars, Alpha and Beta Centauri, stood above the ice plateau as the brightest objects in that part of the sky, easily the two brightest stars visible from this position. She had spent many breaks through the winter looking at these two stars, which appeared to the naked eye as a single close pair, but which her binoculars resolved into distinct points with a very slight color difference, one a warm yellow-white, the other a cooler blue-white. The star atlas she had borrowed from the library described the closer of the two as the nearest star system to the Sun. She had thought about this sometimes, looking at a specific point of light and understanding that it was the nearest stellar object to the place where she was standing. The distance to that nearest stellar object was a figure she had looked up in the atlas's appendix, about 4 light-years, or roughly 40 trillion kilometers. The radio signals she worked with in the radio room, the signals she was transmitting and receiving all night, the HF waves she was listening to, traveled at the speed of light. A signal transmitted from the station at this moment would reach the nearest star system in 4 years. A contact with Tromsø, 8,000 kilometers away, had a one-way transit time of about 27 milliseconds. She was aware of this figure when she worked the long-distance contacts, though it was not something she could perceive directly. The transit time was imperceptible in voice communication. It was only in the longest HF paths, where the signal made several ionospheric hops and the two-way transit time accumulated to hundreds of milliseconds, that the delay occasionally became faintly perceptible as a slight lag in the communication rhythm. She watched the two stars for a moment longer. And then she went back to the instrument room. Outside temperature, -29. Wind speed, 8 knots. Wind direction, south-southwest. Pressure, 982 millibars, falling slowly. Cloud, 0 octaves, clear. She encoded this into the standard METOBS format and transmitted it on the meteorological frequency. The transmission was largely automated. She keyed in the values and the system formatted and sent them in the standard code that the World Meteorological Organization required. These observations, taken at Troll every 6 hours around the clock, were part of the Global Surface Observation Network. The Antarctic was a significant driver of global atmospheric circulation, and the observations from the continent stations, few as they were, carried weight in the numerical weather prediction models. She had thought about this in the first months. A reading of -29 in a panel display, a set of keystrokes, and somewhere a number in the global model, contributing in some small fraction to a forecast for a city that would never know where the number had come from. She had asked the meteorologist about this once, in the early weeks. He had explained the model assimilation process, how the observations from surface stations were incorporated into the initial conditions of the forecast models, weighted by their location's importance and the reliability of the measuring instrument. Antarctic surface observations were weighted more heavily than mid-latitude observations for certain types of forecast. The pressure patterns over the Southern Ocean affected the strength and timing of weather systems that moved into the southern continents. A pressure reading from Troll was not merely a curiosity, but a constraint on what the model could predict for a city 3,000 kilometers to the north. He had also explained that the gaps in Antarctic observation coverage, the large areas where there were no surface stations, were a known source of forecast error. The stations that did exist were therefore proportionally more important in the model than they would be if the coverage were complete. Every observation she transmitted was one more constraint on a model that had too few constraints in this region. She had found this useful to know. It was the kind of knowledge that gave the routine observation work a clear context. She transmitted the metobes with the same care after the conversation with the meteorologist that she had before it. The weather instruments were calibrated at the beginning of each season and checked against a portable reference instrument every 3 months. The current calibration was from the beginning of the winter and had been verified in the most recent logistics visit. She had a calibration log for each instrument and kept it in the same file as the antenna records. The most recently checked instrument was the anemometer, which had shown a reading 2% above the reference on the last check. She had noted this and included it in the report to Tromsø. The 2% discrepancy was within the instrument's specification and no adjustment had been recommended. She went back to the radio room and refilled her cup. The band was quiet. She monitored. She had made herself a second cup of coffee from the thermos, the third of the shift, and sat with it. The warmth of the cup in her hands was a familiar part of the monitoring period. Coffee, the soft hiss of the receiver, the logbook open to the current page, the porthole showing the dark sky. These constituted the shift's characteristic texture in the quiet periods. The shift had a rhythm of its own, one she had learned in the first weeks and now inhabited without conscious thought. The monitoring periods between skeds were not waiting so much as a different mode of attention, active rather than reactive, tuned to the band and its qualities rather than to a specific expected signal. She scanned the frequency ranges systematically, pausing at points of interest, listening to what the band was doing. She had a specific scanning pattern for the monitoring periods. It was not in any written procedure. She had developed it herself, based on what she found most useful. The pattern started at 2 MHz, near the bottom of the HF spectrum, and moved up in steps of approximately 500 kHz, pausing at each step for about 30 seconds to assess the noise level and listen for any significant signals. This took about 20 minutes to complete the full sweep from 2 to 30 MHz. She ran the sweep twice per hour during the monitoring periods. The sweep at 2 MHz was almost always the same, a low, broad hiss, the combined noise of the aurora and the equipment and the cosmic background. Very few identifiable signals because the 2 MHz band was allocated primarily to maritime and amateur uses, and neither was heavily occupied at this latitude. The signal attenuation at 2 MHz in the polar night was high. The frequency was low enough that it passed through the D layer rather than reflecting from the F layer, which meant long-distance propagation was poor. At 4 MHz the maritime traffic became more audible. This was the primary international maritime frequency band, and ships used it for position reporting and routine communications with coast stations. The signals she heard on this band were not addressed to her station, but their presence was useful information. A strong 4 MHz signal from a specific direction indicated that propagation in that direction was open. A weak signal from a station she expected to hear strongly indicated that the path had closed. At 7 MHz, the character of the band changed again. This was the primary amateur HF band for the southern hemisphere, and at this hour it had sporadic activity, individual stations calling and working each other, sometimes in voice and sometimes in digital modes. She had learned to identify the sound of different digital modes over the months, the high-pitched warbling of PSK31, the staccato bursts of FT8, the continuous tones of RTTY. The amateur operators on this band were doing what she was doing, communicating across distance, using ionospheric propagation, but in a less structured way, without fixed schedules, calling into the band and responding to whoever answered. Above 10 MHz the band became quieter. The higher frequency bands required a more active ionosphere to support long-distance propagation, and at this latitude in polar winter the ionosphere was not reliably active enough for the higher bands to be consistently useful. She scanned through 12, 14, 18, 21, and 28 megahertz in quick succession, pausing briefly at each and usually finding only the noise floor of the receiver. On rare occasions when the ionosphere was particularly well charged, she heard signals on the 18 megahertz band, carriers from distant shortwave broadcasts, or the edge of a data transmission. Tonight there was nothing above 10 megahertz worth noting. In the deepest hours of the night between 02 and 04 UTC, the HF band at this latitude was at its quietest. The aurora tended to be less active during these hours. The distant thunderstorm noise from lower latitudes, which arrived through the night via ionospheric propagation, began to thin as the convective systems of the previous day's tropical afternoon died out on the other side of the world. The band became cleaner. The background hiss lowered. The receiver's own thermal noise, the fundamental limit below which no external signal could be detected, became more apparent. She liked these hours. They were the quietest point in the schedule, with no skeds until 4:30, and the monitoring task had a particular purity. She sat in the warm room with her coffee, and the soft hiss of the receiver, and the log open to the current page, and the aurora outside the porthole, reduced to the simplest version of what the work was: listening, recording, waiting. In the quiet, the listening was the primary thing. She had trained her attention across many watches to distinguish the components of what she heard on the band. This was not something that could be taught directly. The descriptions in the training material were accurate as far as they went, but the actual sounds needed to be heard many times before they were distinguishable from each other in the way that was useful for operating. The thermal noise of the receiver was the most constant component. It was always there, a white hiss, the sound of electrons moving randomly in the receiver's front-end amplifier, independent of any outside signal. She had learned its level on each of the two transceivers so that she could use the measured noise level as a reference point. When the background sound was above this reference, something external was contributing. When the background was at the reference level, the band was very quiet. The aurora noise was above this reference on most polar nights. It had a character that was different from the receiver's own thermal noise, a slightly lower frequency quality, a texture that was warmer and more variable, rising and falling in slow rhythms that corresponded to the visual movements of the aurora outside the porthole. On active aurora nights, this noise rose to a level that made copy of weak signals difficult. On quiet nights like this one, it was a background quality, present but not dominating. The atmospheric noise from distant thunderstorm activity arrived from lower latitudes and had yet a different character: sharp, irregular impulses at very low rates, the static of a lightning stroke that had propagated thousands of kilometers to reach her antenna. This noise was most prevalent in the evening hours when the tropical convective systems of the other hemisphere's afternoon were at their peak. By the early morning hours it had faded. Underneath all of these, sometimes, the signals of stations and ships and other transmitters, the carriers and voices and data transmissions, that the ionosphere scattered in all directions and that occasionally arrived at her antenna at sufficient strength to be heard. Most of these were not identifiable, and she did not try to identify them. She listened to them the way she listened to all the rest, as components of the band's character. Information about what the ionosphere was doing, rather than about the content of the transmissions. She checked the number 1 transceiver. The older set was configured to monitor a different frequency band from the number 2. During the intervals between primary contacts, she kept it on the international distress calling frequency, while the number 2 handled the primary band monitoring, so that she maintained a listening watch on both channels simultaneously. The number 1's slight audio hum was less problematic in this role. She was not trying to copy fine detail, only to hear the unmistakable pattern of a call. The number 1's hum came from a loose transformer lamination in its power supply. The engineer had found this when he investigated the source of the sound. The fault was not critical and would be addressed at the next service visit. In the meantime, she used the set for monitoring and backup roles where the hum was less significant. The number 2 handled all the primary contact work. She checked the squelch setting, slightly above the current noise floor, set to open on a signal without triggering on background noise. She confirmed the squelch tail was functioning, the brief burst of static, when the squelch closed by tuning through a busy portion of the band until she heard a carrier, then returning to the distress frequency and listening to the squelch open and close. All normal. She had made the same check of this equipment many dozens of times over the winter. It took less than 2 minutes, and she had never found the number 1 to be anything other than normal. The reliability of the equipment had been one of the things she had adjusted her expectations about in the first months. She had expected the extreme environment to create more problems with equipment than it actually did. The gear designed for Antarctic deployment was built with these conditions in mind: the cold, the dry air, the sustained period of operation, and it performed as designed. The number 1 set had an audio hum that was not ideal but was within specification for a set of its age. Nothing had failed. The number 2 had been serviced during the summer maintenance period. A technician had come out and replaced the fan bearings and the front panel switch mechanism, which had been developing a slight intermittent contact. Since the service, it had been noticeably better than before. She had noted this in the log. The clean receiver quality of the number 2 after the service was measurably better than before, specifically in the low signal conditions where the receiver's noise figure mattered most. She went back to the primary monitoring task. She ran the frequency sweep again from 2 MHz, moving through the band in the same systematic pattern she had used at the beginning of the quiet period. The band was essentially unchanged from the first sweep. The 4 MHz maritime traffic was slightly quieter than it had been. This was consistent with the gradual thinning of traffic in the early hours as watches changed and less routine communication was conducted. The 7 MHz amateur band was also quieter. She noted the band state in the monitoring section of the log: quiet, noise floor 10 decibels, no significant signals on any monitored frequency. She put the headset down and looked through the porthole. The aurora had faded. The sky was clear and very dark, the stars sharp and immense. The Southern Cross was at its lowest point now, barely above the horizon to the south, the 4 principal stars arranged in a compact diamond. To the east, higher in the sky, she could see the nebula in the Sword of Orion, a distinct patch of diffuse light, the same object that appeared in the star charts as a small cloudy smudge that looked like nothing when you looked at it directly, but resolved into a glow at the edge of vision. She had been learning the southern sky over the winter. She had known the northern sky from childhood: Orion above the horizon in the Bergen winter nights, the plough overhead, the Milky Way faintly visible on the clearest nights in the countryside outside the city. The southern sky had required learning, and the polar night had given her the time and the darkness to learn it. She had a small star atlas in her room, acquired in the station's library, and she had worked through it over the months with the sky visible through the porthole or, on some nights, briefly from outside the station with a headlamp turned off. The atlas had an introductory section written for the Southern Hemisphere observer who had spent their previous life in the north. It described the unfamiliar experience of seeing the sky upside down in the Southern Hemisphere. The familiar constellations that a northern observer knew were inverted, so that Orion appeared with Rigel at the top rather than the bottom, the belt stars running in the opposite apparent direction. She had recognized this immediately when she first went outside at the southern station years earlier and looked up. The northern sky rearranged. The atlas also described which features of the southern sky were most distinctive: the Southern Cross and the pointer stars of Centaurus as the primary orientation landmarks, the large and small Magellanic Clouds as the nearest galaxies visible to the naked eye, the Omega Centauri globular cluster visible as a fuzzy star near the horizon, the Coalsack Dark Nebula as a void in the Milky Way's band. She had worked through these features one by one over the winter months, finding each in the sky and identifying it against the atlas. She had developed preferences. The Southern Cross was the obvious landmark, too low in the sky from this latitude to be convenient, but useful as a directional reference. The long axis of the cross pointed toward the south celestial pole when extended. She preferred the Centaurus region, high overhead in the late winter nights, its principal stars enormously bright. She had spent a full 20-minute break looking at the binary pair in Centaurus through a small pair of binoculars borrowed from the science room. The two stars' separate points of light and their very slight color difference perceptible to careful eyes. She had also spent considerable time looking at the Carina Nebula, a region of the Milky Way visible from this latitude as a bright area of the galactic band with concentrations of young stars and ionized gas that made it brighter than the surrounding Milky Way. The atlas described it as one of the largest visible nebulae in the sky. In the binoculars it was a distinct brightening, not the point of a star but an area with texture, brighter at the center and fading toward the edges, the individual stars within it resolvable on the best nights. She had documented her sky learning in the personal notebook in her room. Not systematically, in the way that an astronomer might, but in the way that someone working through a new body of knowledge documents their progress. What she had identified, when, what she had noticed. At 03:30 she walked through the station. This was not in any written procedure. She had developed the habit in her second month, when she noticed that sitting in the chair for 12 hours without moving produced a stiffness in her lower back that made the final hours uncomfortable. The walk took about 20 minutes, along the main corridor to the kitchen, into the kitchen for water or a piece of the bread left out for overnight staff, back along the corridor past the equipment room, through the equipment corridor, and back to the radio room. The station was warm throughout. The heating system maintained a steady positive temperature everywhere inside, creating a large thermal gradient between the interior and the exterior. She felt the building's warmth as a physical fact wherever she moved through it, the heat in the floor, the warmth of the walls, the slight dryness of the heated air. The dry air had affected her in the first month, her lips, the skin of her hands, and she had learned to manage it with the lip salve she kept in her jacket pocket and the moisturizer she used each morning and each evening. The station was a building designed for its purpose in every detail, and she had come to know these details over the winter in the way that one came to know a ship, not as a set of features that impressed you with novelty, but as a set of known things whose reliability you depended on. The heating system was oil-fired, with a series of radiators throughout the building and backup electric elements in the most critical areas. The ventilation system brought outside air in through a heated intake and exhausted inside air out through a controlled vent, maintaining a slight positive pressure inside the building to prevent cold air infiltrating through gaps. She had not fully understood the significance of this positive pressure when she arrived. She understood it now, in the middle of winter, when even a brief door opening produced a visible inrush of cold and frost at the threshold. The building's exterior was insulated to a specification that she had read in the station documentation shortly after arriving. The insulation value was substantial, enough to maintain interior temperatures above 15 degrees Celsius in outside conditions of -40, with normal heating load. She had not seen -40 yet. The coldest night of the winter had been -37 on a clear, still night in early July. The building had held its temperature without the heating system working noticeably harder. The kitchen at 03:30 was empty and dim, the main lights off, and only the work light above the stove burning, left on as a courtesy to overnight workers. Someone had left bread wrapped on the counter. She recognized the cloth, the same material the station baker used. She took a slice and ate it standing. The bread was dense and slightly sweet, the same recipe the baker had been making since the beginning of the winter. He was a meteorologist by profession and a meticulous baker by inclination, and he applied the same systematic attention to both. The bread was consistent from one week to the next in a way that suggested careful temperature control and accurate timing. She had eaten more bread this winter than in any previous period of her life, and had found that this was not a problem. She took the piece back to the counter and sat on the stool beside the kitchen table. The kitchen at 03:30 had a specific quality of quiet. Unlike the quiet of the radio room, which was the quiet of a working space between its working moments, the kitchen's quiet was the quiet of a space between its primary uses. The kitchen in the morning and lunchtime hours was the station's most social room, the point where the crew overlapped, where information was exchanged, where the day's mood was established. At 03:30, It was a room waiting for all of this to begin again. She ate the bread slowly. The bakery smell was still faint in the room. She had noticed it at the beginning of the winter as a distinct smell, and now she was less aware of it. The combination of bread smell and coffee residue, and the particular smell of the heating system gave the kitchen a composite character that she associated with the station in the same way that she associated the pine soot and glue smell with the radio room, a specific characteristic that had become unremarkable through familiarity. The crew she had spent the winter with numbered 12 in total, which was on the larger end for a winter over. A smaller station might have 6 or 8. The 12 included the 2 radio operators, the meteorologist and his baker's second role, the cook, the engineer, the doctor, 3 scientists and their support technicians, and the station leader. She knew each of them well in the way that 12 people confined to a building for a polar winter came to know each other, thoroughly in some respects, and not at all in others. The radio work was her area, and she was respected in it. She respected the meteorologist's weather data and the engineer's work on the building systems and the cook's ability to produce good food from the limited fresh supply. The scientist's work she understood in outline and not in detail. The social texture of 12 people in a confined space for a winter was something she had navigated before at the larger station, with the larger crew. The current crew was manageable. There had been one difficult period in June when the combination of deep polar night and a sustained series of storm days had made the station's interior feel smaller than it was. This had passed when the weather broke and the aurora came back and the outside was visible again. She filled her water bottle at the tap and walked back. The corridor at this hour had the feel of a vessel at night, the same containment, the same low lights, the same sense of the working structure continuing around her while most of the crew was at rest. She had worked 2 summers on research vessels before her first Antarctic posting, and had found the comparison useful. The station had the same logic as a ship, a defined space, a defined crew, a defined task, everything inside it oriented toward maintaining the work through whatever conditions the outside presented. She passed the equipment room on her way back and stopped briefly to check the generator reading on the panel just inside the door. The generator was not her direct responsibility. The engineer looked after it, but she checked it on the walk, because the generator was the station's most critical system and the reading on the panel gave an immediate indication of whether it was running normally. The reading showed normal output and normal fuel consumption. She noted this in her mind without writing it anywhere. The equipment room also held the SATCOM terminal, the Iridium and Inmarsat equipment that provided satellite-based communication independent of the HF radio. She checked the signal indicator on the terminal as she passed, 4 bars on both systems. The SATCOM was always on standby, and she checked it once per shift as a matter of practice, not because there was a sched scheduled, but because if the HF failed, a transceiver fault, antenna damage, severe ionospheric disturbance, the SATCOM was the backup. Knowing it was working at the beginning and middle and end of the shift was the kind of check that cost 30 seconds and was worth having on record. She went back to the radio room. She sat down at the desk and checked the clock. 0350. 40 minutes until the next sched. She put on the lighter headset, not the full headset she used during busy contact periods, but the single earpiece she wore for monitoring, which let her hear the radio with one ear while keeping the other open for any sound from the station. She scanned through the lower frequency bands slowly, listening. The 4 MHz band was the most active at this hour. It was the primary maritime communication band, and it carried a scattered traffic of ship and coast stations, most of them far from the Antarctic, their signals arriving by various ionospheric paths at reduced strength. She moved through the band slowly, pausing at each audible signal for a few seconds before moving on. She could hear the partial carrier of a station transmitting in a mode she did not recognize, not single sideband voice, something narrower and more structured, probably a digital data mode of some kind. The carrier had a particular pattern to it, a burst transmission style, the carrier going up for a few seconds and then dropping back, the content not audible as any voice or Morse, but as a digital tone pattern. Lower in the band she found a faint but readable Morse code transmission, the rhythm of the dots and dashes slow enough to be hand-sent rather than machine-generated. She was licensed for Morse and could copy it at moderate speed. She had learned it years before as a requirement of her early radio certificate and had maintained the skill through the years since, occasionally practicing on the slow Morse that came through on the monitoring shifts. She listened to the rhythm for a moment. The spacing was even, the individual characters clean, the operator competent at a moderate speed. She did not try to read the content. The transmission was not addressed to any station on her schedule, and it was not distress traffic. She listened to the rhythm of it for a minute, the quality of the sending, the faint variation in tone that told her the signal had arrived via a long path, possibly more than one ionospheric hop, and then moved further down the band in her scan. Below the maritime band, she found the low-frequency edge of the HF spectrum, where the frequency allocation changed from maritime mobile to the fixed and broadcasting services. She did not normally monitor this far down. The station's antennas were not efficient at these very low HF frequencies, but occasionally a strong signal arrived here by anomalous propagation and was worth noting. Tonight there was nothing unusual. She moved the receiver back to the monitoring frequency and took a note about the band conditions: 4 MHz active, moderate traffic density, aurora noise below the active signals. 7 MHz, the amateur band, had some traffic visible on the receiver's spectrum display, though she was not monitoring this band directly. The 10 MHz band was quiet. At 0430, she made contact with the Argentine Marambio station on the Antarctic peninsula. The path from Troll to Marambio was about 2,000 kilometers across the southern part of the continent, a longer path than Neumayer, but shorter than Tromsø. She had worked Marambio many times over the winter. The operator tonight was a man she had spoken to twice before, enough to recognize his careful English. The Argentine operators used English for the international net, as she used English rather than Norwegian, and as the Neumayer operator used English rather than German. English on the Antarctic frequency schedule was the common language in the same way it was the common language of international aviation. She had thought about this sometime. The Antarctic net was a network of stations scattered across the most remote continent in the world, staffed by people from a dozen countries, all using a common language to coordinate work that was particular to each nation's program. The HF radio was the medium and English was the code, and neither required any of the operators to have met in person or to know anything about each other beyond the voice on the frequency and the quality of the operating technique. The contact came up on 6825 kilohertz. Signal 5 and 8, both ways. The exchange covered the standard items and added nothing unusual. Marambio reported overcast skies and a moderate south wind that was beginning to build. She gave them the station weather, -29, still clear. The operator at Marambio read this back with a slight quality in his voice that might have been the pleasure of comparing weather, his building wind and cloud against her clear and still. She did not try to interpret this. She confirmed the readback and closed the contact. 0438. She wrote the entry. The log page was filling. 4 contacts recorded, plus the noise measurements and the weather observation, plus the antenna maintenance notes from the beginning of the shift. She drew a line across the page beneath the Marambio entry and began a new subsection for the monitoring notes from the quiet hours. The monitoring notes were her own addition to the standard log format. The required format recorded only the scheduled contacts and the mandatory measurements. She had begun adding a short monitoring section in her second month, a few lines describing the band conditions during the quiet periods, noting unusual signals she had heard, characterizing the noise floor and its variations. Over the months, these additions had accumulated into something like a continuous account of the band's behavior through the polar night. She had shared some of the notes with the ionospheric researcher in Tromsø. He had written back that the informal descriptions often contained information that was not captured in the standard measurements, the qualitative character of the noise, the way specific propagation paths changed over the course of the night, the correlation between the aurora's visual appearance and the band's behavior. He had asked permission to cite some of her monitoring notes in a paper he was preparing. She had given it without hesitation. The monitoring notes she wrote in the hour between the Marambio contact and the beginning of the handover work covered 3 items. The first was the band condition at the end of the deep quiet period. Noise floor at 10 decibels, 4 MHz showing moderate maritime traffic, no unusual signals on any monitored frequency. The second was an observation about the aurora's behavior during the shift, active from about 01 to 03 UTC, quiet thereafter, the transition from active to quiet, taking about 20 minutes rather than the abrupt change that sometimes occurred. The third was a comparison with the corresponding shift 2 weeks earlier. On that shift, the aurora had been active at the same hours but had produced a noise level of 17 decibels rather than today's 14. The current aurora was quieter. She noted this without drawing a conclusion. She was always careful about conclusions in the monitoring notes. Observations could be stated with confidence. Conclusions required more data than a single shift provided. She observed and recorded, and left the conclusions for the accumulation of data over time, or for the researchers who worked with the accumulated data from a longer distance. The hour between the Marambio contact and the start of the handover work was the quietest of the shift. No sked scheduled, the monitoring running on its own rhythm, the band quiet. She used this hour to check the logbook's current entries one more time, looking for any gaps or errors in the record. She found one. In the 2330 Neumeier entry, she had written the frequency as 6810 kHz, which was correct, but the signal report she had received from Neumeier she had written as 5 and 8 rather than 5 and 9. She looked at her pencil note on the frequency prediction chart, where she had written both signal reports at the time of the contact, her report to them 5 and 9, their report to her 5 and 9. The log entry was wrong. She corrected the entry, drawing a neat line through the incorrect figure and writing the correct one above it, initialing the correction. Small errors like this happened occasionally on the long overnight shift, when tiredness affected the transcription from the working note to the formal record. She had developed the habit of the end-of-shift review, specifically to catch these errors before they propagated into the official archive. The correction made, the log was accurate. At 5:30, she began writing the handover notes. The day operator arrived at 0800. She had 2.5 hours remaining. The last sked was at 7:15, a brief contact with the South African Sinai 4th station, and after that she would complete the handover package. The handover notes covered equipment status as of end of shift, anomalies observed, band conditions summary, operational information from the skeds, antenna status, weather trend, and any items requiring the day operator's attention. She had developed a specific format for these notes in her first weeks, refining it as she understood more about what the day operator needed, and what information failed to survive in her own memory when she was tired at the end of the shift. She drafted tonight's handover as she monitored. The handover notes followed the format she and Tor had established in the first month. She began with equipment, because the equipment status was the first thing an incoming operator needed to know, whether the transceivers and antennas were functioning normally, or whether there was a problem to work around. Equipment. All primary equipment normal. Number 2, transceiver performing well, receiver clean throughout the shift, the slight warm-up noise present in the first 5 minutes of operation before the front end settled. This was normal for this set, and she noted it as normal so Tor would not be concerned by it. Number 1, transceiver performing normally on distress watch, squelch set at standard. A 2 rhombic SWR 1.21 at start of shift and 1.21 at end, consistent and clean. A 1 dipole normal, icing note from November carried forward for the record. Antenna switch and tuning units functioning as expected. SATCOM, 4 bars on both Iridium and Inmarsat, checked at 0330. She wrote the band conditions section more carefully than the equipment section. The band conditions summary needed to give Tor not just what had happened during her shift, but a sense of what to expect in his, what the frequency prediction chart was showing, what the K-index trend implied, which paths had been performing above or below the prediction. Band conditions, K-index 3 throughout shift, Moderate noise 12 to 15 decibels during the active aurora period from 01 to 03 UTC, falling to 10 after the aurora quieted. Frequency selections performed as predicted from the ionosonde for all but the ship contact at 2230, where the signal was approximately 2 s-units better than predicted, noted in the frequency prediction chart for future reference. Higher bands workable for intra-Antarctic contacts throughout. Tromsø path good on 8 MHz throughout the shift. Forecast. Space Weather Prediction Center is forecasting a K-index rise to 4 or 5 for tomorrow, associated with the CME reported 2 days ago. Recommend planning lower frequency alternatives for the morning skids, particularly for the Tromsø path, in case the 8 MHz band is degraded. She paused and looked at what she had written. The forecast information was the most important item in the handover for the upcoming shift. She added a line of emphasis in the margin. CME arrival tomorrow. Check space weather update at start of shift. Contacts, ship contact 2230 on 4635 kHz. Signal moderate, position and weather, exchanged, no operational concerns. Numea 2330 on 6810. Excellent propagation. Signal 5 and 9 both ways. Noted aurora highly active at their location the previous night, now quiet. Tromsø 030 on 8955. Signal good 5 and 8 both ways. Operational notes as detailed in log, including mail on planned aircraft. Marambio 0430 on 6825. Signal good 5 and 8 both ways. No operational matters, their weather building with south wind. Weather. -29 at 0200. Pressure falling slowly. 979 millibars at 0200. Continuing to fall, front approaching from the west. Significant impact not expected for 36 hours. Clear sky at all weather observations during shift. Aurora visible and quiet to moderately active. She read through the draft. The notes were clear and complete. She had found over the months that writing the handover carefully at the end of a shift when she was tired was better than writing it earlier in the shift and then adding to it, because the later version reflected the full picture of what the shift had been. A handover written at 5 in the morning after 12 hours of work was sometimes less polished than the same notes written at midnight, but it was more accurate about what had happened in the full 12 hours. She added one line at the end: coffee thermos requires refill. She underlined it. At 7:15 she made the Sanae 4 contact. The South African National Antarctic Expedition Station at Sanae 5 was in Sverdrup-Fjella, also in Queen Maud Land, 1,200 kilometers to the northwest. The path ran across the ice sheet, through the ionosphere above Queen Maud Land, in conditions that were largely the same at both ends of the path, since both stations were in the same broad ionospheric region. This made the path predictable in a way that the longer paths to Tromsø and to the ships were not. When the local ionosphere was good, the Sanae contact was good. When it was disturbed by aurora, both ends suffered similarly. Tonight, the local ionosphere was quiet and the contact was clean. She had worked with the Sanae operators less frequently than with Numea and Tromsø, because the schedule had them at the lower priority frequency bands for much of the season. But the contacts she had made with Sanae had produced consistently good signals on the path, and she had noted in her frequency prediction chart that the 4465 kHz frequency was reliable for this path at all hours she had tried it. She gave Sanae a 5 and 8 and received a 5 and 7. The exchange was brief. Signal reports, weather given and received, nothing to report from either station. The Sanae operator's English was precise and careful, the exchanges complete and unambiguous. The contact closed in 5 minutes. She wrote the final log entry of the shift. The Sanae entry took 2 minutes to complete properly. Call signs, frequencies, signal reports, weather exchanged, duration. She read the entry back to herself against the working note she had made during the contact. The frequency was correct, the signal reports were correct, the weather figures she had read back from Sanae were correct. The duration was 5 minutes, and she wrote 5 in the duration column. The page was full now. She turned to a new page, wrote the date and 0800 at the top, and left it blank. That page would be Tor's to begin. She closed the logbook at her completed page and placed the handover notes on top of it. She looked at the completed page one more time before she covered it with the handover notes. The 12 hours were there in the columns, the contact records in order, the hourly noise readings in the noise column, the weather observation, the antenna checks, the monitoring notes in the margin. The page was the shift's record, complete and accurate. It would go into the archive at the end of the season and would remain there. She put the handover notes on top and clipped them in place with the small metal clip that lived on the corner of the logbook. The clip had been in the radio room since before her posting. She did not know when it had arrived or who had put it there. It was simply part of the equipment of the job. She went through the equipment in the closing sequence. The closing sequence was the shift's final act, the equivalent of the opening checks she had done at the beginning. Where the opening sequence was about confirming what was working and setting the parameters for the shift, the closing sequence was about confirming that everything was in the right state for the handover, all settings as the incoming operator would expect, all documentation complete, nothing left mid-task. She went through the sequence from left to right across the equipment panel, as she always did, working systematically rather than from memory of what needed checking. Systematic was better than by memory on the 12th hour of a shift. Number 2 transceiver, frequency cleared to the listening frequency, controls set to standby mode, transmit power dial at the standard setting. Antenna switch confirmed on 8-2, the rhombic. Antenna tuning unit in standby mode, the last tuning position saved in the unit's memory. Squelch levels confirmed at the standard setting that Tor used as well as she did. Number 1 transceiver, frequency confirmed on the distress and calling frequency, squelch confirmed at the standard level. She transmitted a brief carrier to confirm the output power and released the key. Power normal. VHF radio, confirmed on monitoring, squelch confirmed. Weather instrument panel, all readings within expected range. The outside temperature gauge showed -31. The anemometer showed the wind had picked up slightly from the lull at midnight, 6 knots now. Pressure still falling slowly. All consistent with the forecast. Logbook, current page complete, handover notes printed on a separate sheet and clipped to the front of the logbook. She returned the frequency prediction charts to their file and removed the old space weather forecast, which was now 1 day old, and replaced it with the current day's issue that had come through on the automated print service at 0100. She placed the new forecast in the file where Tor would find it. The new forecast showed the same K-index prediction she had noted earlier, the expected rise to 4 or 5 associated with the incoming CME. She had already noted this in the handover notes. The forecast in the file would give Tor the full detail if he wanted to read the source document. The file for the space weather forecasts was a clip folder that held the most recent 2 weeks of forecasts in reverse chronological order. She removed the oldest document from the bottom of the file to keep the stack from growing too thick. The removed document she placed in the paper recycling box beside the equipment rack. She sat in the chair in the quiet room. The equipment hummed its low, steady hum. The number 1 transceiver was monitoring the distress frequency, its squelch closed, the channel clear. The number 2 was on standby, its display showing the frequency and the receiver level at their resting values. The porthole showed nothing but dark sky and stars. The aurora was gone entirely. No trace remained at the southern horizon, the sky there as dark and clear as the zenith. The Southern Cross was lower in the sky than at midnight, moving with the rotation of the Earth along its slow arc, its 4 principal stars arranged in a compact pattern above the southern horizon. In another hour the cross would be at its lowest point, and the rotation would begin to carry it east again. She had looked through this porthole thousands of times over the winter. The view was always the same. A small circle of double-paned glass, the outer pane sometimes fogged or iced, depending on the conditions, and through it a section of sky that was dark for months at a time, and then, when the polar night ended, briefly lighted the edges before the sun finally returned above the horizon. The view was not variable in the way that a view of a landscape was variable. There was no foreground feature that changed with the weather, no vegetation that moved or grew, no animals, no people. The sky was the only thing visible, and the sky changed over the scale of months. She had come to find the constancy peaceful rather than monotonous. The porthole showed her the sky's current state, and the sky's current state was relevant to her work. This made the view functional as well as aesthetic. She did not need the view to be varied. She needed it to be clear. There would be no dawn. This was the fact of the polar night, restated each morning. The dark would not lift at this hour, or at any other hour this day. The sun was below the horizon and would remain there for another 5 weeks, tracing its shallow arc below the horizon's level, but never rising above it at this latitude. The station's clocks moved through their numbers, 7, 8, 9, 10, without the corresponding change in the sky that the numbers implied at other latitudes. She had looked up the exact geometry in the first weeks. At the station's latitude, the sun's highest point below the horizon during the polar night was at local apparent noon. At the depth of winter, this highest point was about 15 degrees below the horizon, deep enough that not even the faintest twilight reached the sky. Closer to the equinoxes, the sun came higher below the horizon and a faint twilight glow appeared at noon on clear days. Not the glow of dawn or dusk, but a pale brightening at the north horizon that lasted an hour and faded. This twilight had begun to appear recently in the late July days, a change she had noticed and written in her notebook. It was the first perceptible sign that the polar night was ending, and it had the quality of anything long waited for, unmistakable when it arrived but different from what expectation had prepared. She had adjusted to this over the months. In the first weeks of the polar night, she had noticed herself waiting for the sky to lighten in the east, a habitual expectation from a lifetime at mid-latitudes, where the sky always changed at dawn. The expectation had faded as the darkness continued without variation through morning after morning. She no longer expected the sky to change at dawn. The dark was the state, and the dawn was not coming. What she had not expected was how thoroughly the psychological adjustment had completed itself. She had read accounts of the polar night before her first Antarctic posting, the standard literature that described the challenges of winter over, the potential for mood disturbance, the importance of maintaining routine and light exposure. She had taken these accounts seriously and had prepared accordingly. And then the winter had arrived, and she had found that the adaptation was easier than the literature had suggested, at least for her. The darkness became simply the character of the outside, unchanging and expected, requiring neither resistance nor special management. The light inside the station was adequate for all the tasks that required light. The work gave the hours their structure. The shift schedule gave the days their rhythm. What she had not fully anticipated was what the darkness revealed. She had expected deprivation, the absence of daylight, the absence of color, the absence of the visual world as she knew it. What she found instead was that the darkness cleared the sky of everything that competed with what was actually there. The aurora in the dark was more present and more strange than any aurora she had seen at lower latitudes during Arctic nights. The stars in the Antarctic dark were the stars she had never fully seen before, the southern sky of a continent that had almost no permanent human habitation and no competing light. What she noticed instead of what was absent was what was actually there. The moon, when it was up, gave the ice surface a gray-blue luminosity that had a specific quality she had not seen described in anything she had read before coming. It was not simply reflected moonlight. The snow and ice surface seemed to hold the light and distribute it in a way that made the ice plateau visible as a distinct entity, the slight texture of the surface visible in the moonlight, the sastrugi casting small shadows, the line of the horizon sharp against the sky in a way that was not visible in darkness. She had thought the polar night would be uniform. It was not. Each night had its own specific state. The state depended on whether there was cloud or clear sky, whether the aurora was active or absent, whether the moon was up or below the horizon, whether there was wind and drift or stillness. She had begun keeping note of these states in the personal notebook in her room, not the official log, which recorded only the operational parameters, but the private document where she wrote what she actually observed on each shift, the character of the night, and the specific quality of the sky. The door opened and Tor came in, carrying his thermos. He saw her empty thermos on the shelf and she held it up briefly, confirming what the sight of it already told him. He nodded. He set his own thermos down and picked up the handover notes. She waited while he read. Tor read handover notes carefully, as she did. This was something they had in common from the beginning. She had worked with operators who read handover notes quickly, skimming for major items and missing the smaller ones. This was reasonable when the equipment was all functioning normally, and the band was quiet. It was a problem when one of the smaller items was the thing that turned out to matter. Tor read carefully, and she had never seen him miss anything. He worked through the equipment status first, his eyes moving from the written description to the equipment panel and back, checking that what she had described matched what he saw. Number 2 transceiver. He checked the standby mode, the frequency display, the antenna switch position. He confirmed these matched the notes. When he reached the section on the K-index forecast, he looked up, and she told him what the space weather chart showed for the next 48 hours. She told him the CME arrival timing and the expected frequency impact on the higher bands. He nodded and made a mark in the margin with his pencil. She had seen this habit before, and had started including a specific flag in her handover notes for items she thought he would want to mark. He looked at the completed log page. He ran his finger along a few of the entries, checking the contact times and signal reports. He stopped at the Neumeier entry, and she told him about the correction she had made, the signal report she had transcribed incorrectly and fixed at the end of the shift. He nodded. He sat down in the operator's chair. She stood up and took her jacket from the back of the chair and her empty thermos from the shelf. He was already looking at the receiver panel, orienting to the current state of the equipment. His hand went to the antenna switch and checked the position. His eyes moved to the squelch level indicators. She had seen this orientation process many times at the end of her own shifts, the incoming operator's rapid survey of the equipment's state, confirming that the room was as the handover described it. She went out into the corridor. The building had begun to sound like morning. A voice from the kitchen, the sound of water running. The smell of coffee already in the corridor, stronger than the residue from her own shift. The change of shift moved through the station like a slow tide, the overnight quiet lifting as the day crew woke and began to move. She walked to her room. The corridor at this hour had the specific quality of a transition, from the radio room's concentrated attention to the room's absence of obligation. She had come to notice this quality as a marker of the shift's end, rather than as anything else. The corridor was 20 meters. At the beginning of the shift, it was a brief passage. Now it was a transition with its own texture, the hum of the building around her, and the smell of morning coffee from the kitchen, and her own body's tiredness after 12 hours in the chair. Her room was small, as all rooms at the station were small. A bunk with a sleeping bag, and 2 wool blankets, a small desk and chair, a shelf for books and personal items, a curtained window. The curtain was not for darkness. The darkness outside was total, but for the insulation against the cold window glass. She had added a second layer of fabric to the curtain in June, when the outside temperature dropped into the range, where even the double-glazed pane radiated enough cold to lower the room temperature noticeably. The room held her winter's accumulation. The star atlas on the shelf, its spine now soft from handling. A small stack of paperbacks from the station's library, working through one per week. A framed photograph of her family at a summer cabin in Hardanger, the green of the Norwegian summer very bright in the small frame, strange to look at in the context of the polar winter. A notebook she had kept through the winter, separate from the official log, containing her personal observations about the band and the aurora and the sky. She had not started this notebook with the intention of keeping a record. She had started it because the night shift gave her observations that she wanted to write down, and the official log was not the right place for all of them. She changed out of her shift clothes and hung them on the hook by the door. She set the empty thermos on the desk. She sat on the edge of the bunk. The station sounds continued through the wall, the kitchen becoming gradually busier, a brief exchange of voices in the corridor, the sound of doors opening and closing as the crew moved through their morning. She was aware of all of this without attending to it. Her attention had begun to withdraw from the shift's content in the way it always did in the first minutes after handover, the frequency conditions and the log entries and the contact quality receding, replaced by the absence of immediate obligation. She thought about the handover notes and whether she had included everything Tor would need. She thought about the K-index forecast and the planned aircraft next week and the mail on the flight. Then she stopped thinking about any of this, because these were Tor's concerns now and the shift was over. She lay down. The sleeping bag was cool at first and then warmed from her body heat. The room was dark except for the thin line of corridor light under the door. Outside the curtained window, the polar night continued, the Antarctic winter going on without pause, the ice plateau extending in every direction to horizons she had never seen, the cold pressing against the building's exterior from all sides simultaneously. She had learned over the winter that the transition to sleep after a night shift was most reliable when she did not try to direct it. Lying in the dark, the sleeping bag warming, the station sounds continuing through the wall, sleep arrived on its own schedule. Forcing it by attending too closely to the process made it take longer. She had read about this, about the attentional paradox of trying to sleep, how the effort of trying produced a state of wakefulness. She had found the observation accurate and had adjusted her practice accordingly. Lie down, allow the warmth and the dark, and wait without attending. The shift's content would persist in her memory for a while after she closed her eyes. The frequency figures, the signal reports, the aurora outside the porthole, the K-index chart. These were not unwelcome. They were simply the residue of 12 hours of concentrated attention, and they would fade as she lay still. She thought briefly about the forecast increase in the K-index and whether Tor would have difficulty with the morning skeds. She thought about whether she had correctly copied the Marambio signal report and whether the log entry was accurate. Then she stopped thinking about these things, because they belonged to the shift that was finished and not to the hours ahead. The receiving antenna was 300 meters from the window. It was outside in the dark and the cold, in the wind that had dropped to almost nothing overnight. Its wire elements in the positions that the survey had established and the maintenance work had kept over the months. The antenna was always outside, always receiving the continuous thermal noise of the cosmos coming down its feed line and into the equipment that she had just left warm and attended to. She thought about the antennas in the dark for a moment. The rhombic was the largest structure on the station's snowfield. 4 poles and 4 wire spans, the whole assembly aligned with the north. In the polar night the antennas were invisible from the building, but she had walked to each of them at least once over the winter for maintenance or inspection, and she knew each one's position relative to the building and relative to each other. The rhombic was 250 meters to the northwest. The dipoles were closer, to the south and southwest. The VHF aerial was on the building's roof, the nearest antenna to where she was now lying. The radio room was occupied now. The band was in whatever state the band was in. In the radio room, Tor would be looking at the frequency table and reviewing the morning schedule, the contacts that came in the Norwegian and European morning hours, when the propagation to the north was different from the overnight conditions. He would have read the handover notes and the space weather forecast for the day, and made his own plan for which frequencies to use. He would be sitting in the same chair she had just left, the same equipment in front of him, the same distress frequency on the number 1 set, the same porthole showing the same dark sky. The shift would proceed. The contacts would come at their scheduled times. He would write the entries in the log below her last entry on the completed page, starting the new page she had left blank. The winter was approaching its end. In 5 weeks the sun would return to the horizon at local noon, not rising above it, not yet, but close enough to produce a brief twilight glow on clear days. In 7 weeks the sun would clear the horizon for the first time in months. She had been told by the previous winter team what this was like, the specific quality of seeing the sun again after the long dark period. Several of them had described it as surprising even when expected, the light having a quality that was different from remembered light, stronger than expected or different in color. She had not been certain how to interpret these descriptions. She would find out when the time came. She closed her eyes. The station went on around her, the generator maintained its hum, the ventilation moved air through the building, the instruments in the weather room recorded their readings on their automatic cycle, the number 2 transceiver sat on its frequency in standby, the number 1 monitored the distress channel with its squelch set just above the noise floor. In the polar night outside, the ice plateau stretched to the horizon. No wind. The sky clear. The stars cold and very bright in the dry air above the continent. The antennas were in the dark snow field where they had been placed at the beginning of the season, pointed in the directions the survey had established. The rhombic pointed north. The dipole ran east-west. The feed lines ran to the building, and through the building wall to the equipment in the warm radio room. The equipment received whatever the ionosphere chose to deliver, measured it, and recorded it. The monitoring would continue. The skids would come at their scheduled times. The log pages would fill with the same careful columns. In 5 weeks, the twilight would arrive at local noon and begin to grow. The polar night would not end abruptly. It would thin gradually, the noon twilight lengthening day by day, the light returning in slow increments rather than all at once. She had observed the beginning of this process already in the late July noontimes, the faint pale brightening at the north horizon on clear days that the notebook confirmed was real and not imagined. By September the sun would be above the horizon for several hours each day. By October the summer would have begun. The polar night held everything in its particular dark.